about all kinds of stuff. Professor Dave explains.
In examining ancient Mesopotamia, we have looked at Sumer and Assyria thus far, but the city of Babylon was one of the most famous in the ancient world. It became a symbol of luxury, grandeur, and excess that found its way into both the Old and New Testaments, as well as the Greek literature of the Hellenistic age that followed the conquests of Alexander the Great. In fact, the city was so closely identified with the people and the state of Babylonia, the region it controlled, that Babylon and Babylonia became interchangeable, just as Rome would later become synonymous with the Roman Empire. But while the Sumerian and then the Assyrian states had already emerged as regional powers in the 3rd millennium BCE, Babylon was founded around 1900 BCE, and it did not begin to emerge as an important center until the early 18th century, when its king, Hammurabi, conquered the coast of Syria to the west and the Elamites and Gutians to the east, forcing the king of Assyria to abdicate his throne. This left him in control of most of Mesopotamia. His ancestors were Amorites, a people that had come from Syria about 200 years before and dominated the cities of central and southern Mesopotamia. But he made the Babylonian god Marduk one of the most important deities of the south, and Babylon itself became the primary religious center of the region. It may have been during this period that the poem called the Enuma Elish was first written. It describes the creation of the world and humanity, and Marduk is its central figure. He defeats the primordial sea monster Tiamat and creates the earth, the sky and stars, and human beings, and the other gods acknowledge him as their king. At the same time, the Isagala temple of Marduk was at the center of the city's life. The Enuma Elish describes how Marduk founded Babylon as follows: "Build Babylon, let bricks for it be molded, and raise the shrine. When the 2nd year arrived, they raised the peak of Isagala." At the center of the temple was the cult statue of the god, which was made of wood covered in precious metals. The god himself was thought to dwell within this image, and it was part of the coronation ceremony for new kings. It was also taken out of the temple and carried around the city during the New Year celebrations in the spring, when the king would remove his crown, kneel before the statue, and ask that he be given another year of rule because he had performed his duties well. The Babylonians' enemies, who knew the importance of the statue, stole it several times during raids on the city, and each time it was recovered with great pomp and circumstance. The history of its travels is described in a cuneiform text called the Marduk Prophecy. Hammurabi's empire did not survive his death, and though he was remembered by the rulers that followed him as one of the greatest kings of Mesopotamia, he was not known to the Western historical tradition, only to be rediscovered in the 20th century, when the stele, or slab, that recorded his law code was found in Iran. Though this code was not the first one to be issued in Mesopotamia, or even the first to have survived, it was considered the most important throughout the later history of the region, and was used as a practice text for scribes learning to write cuneiform. Since its rediscovery, it has come to be seen as groundbreaking in its detail and comprehensiveness, and for the fact that it assigns official punishments for every offense, rather than allowing the injured party to take whatever action they saw fit. And since earlier codes were more interested in compensating the victim than in punishing the offender, the tone of Hammurabi's laws suggests that the state was taking a more active role by turning what we would call civil cases into criminal ones. The code's punishments also tended to be harsh, perhaps because it was assumed that plaintiffs would otherwise be reluctant to let the courts act in their place. Its discovery shed some light on the origins of what had until then been the only source of law from this region, the Law of Moses, since both the style and the content of Hammurabi's regulations, which are much older, are often paralleled by the books of Exodus and Deuteronomy. Though Hammurabi's descendants could not maintain his empire, they continued to rule the city of Babylon itself and some of the nearby territory. This continued until the city was conquered around 1600 BCE by the Hittites, who replaced its rulers with their allies, the Kassites. They were a people from northwest Iran who were ethnically unrelated to the Mesopotamians. The fact that both the Amorites and the Kassites, and later the Assyrians and the Chaldeans, were able to take control of central Mesopotamia has been attributed to its lack of natural defenses. It also had a relatively weak military culture compared with its neighbors. The Kassites ruled Babylonia for about 450 years, during which they were generally on good terms with Egypt, the Hittite Empire, and Assyria, but often at war with the Elamites to the east. Then, in the later 13th century BCE, Babylon was made a subject of the Assyrian Empire under King Tukulti-ninurta I, and in the mid-12th century, the Kassite dynasty was ended by a combination of Assyrian inroads into its territory and attacks by the Elamites. It was replaced by a new dynasty that lasted for over 100 years. This was the first one to come from Babylonia and to speak Akkadian, and it not only pushed back the Elamites, but one of its kings, Nebuchadnezzar I, attacked the capital of Elam itself. He also fought the Assyrians several times, but around 1100 BCE, Babylonia was decisively defeated by the Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser I, and it continued to be dominated by the Assyrians until the end of the Assyrian Middle Period in the 11th century. After about 100 years of invasions, during which Babylonia changed hands several times, leaving no clear center of authority, it once again was subjected to the Assyrian Empire, which after a period of contraction, reached the height of its size and power in the 10th through 7th centuries BCE. The Assyrian king Tukulti-ninurta II made Babylon a vassal state. This status, which was forced upon many of the cities conquered by the Assyrians, meant that it remained formally independent while agreeing to an unequal relationship in which it owed its loyalty to the current Assyrian ruler and had to pay tribute to him and donate soldiers in wartime. Finally, in 729 BCE, Tiglath-Pileser III annexed Babylon directly, making himself its king, and his successors did the same thing. After the city expressed some resistance to King Sennacherib late in the 8th century, he destroyed most of it, but it was rebuilt by his son Esarhaddon early in the 7th. Esarhaddon appointed his son Ashurbanipal as his successor, while making another son, Shamash-shum-ukin, the ruler of Babylon. But after several years, Shamash-shum-ukin decided to attack his brother in hopes of ruling the entire empire by himself from Babylon, which he did by gathering the forces of all the subject peoples of Assyria. Despite the size of his forces, the rebellion did not succeed. Shamash-shum-ukin died in 648 BCE, and all of his statues were deliberately mutilated in order to wipe out his memory. The Assyrian Empire collapsed after Ashurbanipal's death in 631 BCE, when a fight over leadership broke out, and Babylon, like Assyria's other vassals, took advantage of this to break away and expand into what is now known as the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Its first leader was Nabopolassar, descended from the Chaldeans, nomads from the Syrian coast, who had moved into southeastern Mesopotamia starting in the 9th century. After a few years, Nabopolassar's initiative led him to become part of a joint force of Medes, Persians, Babylonians, and Scythians who attacked the Assyrian heartland and destroyed the capital of Nineveh in 612 BCE. Then, under Nabopolassar's son, Nebuchadnezzar II, the territory of Assyria was divided up among these peoples, and Babylon became the most important city of Mesopotamia. In the early 6th century, Nebuchadnezzar embarked on a series of military campaigns. He brought an end to the Israelite kingdom of Judah, destroying Jerusalem and deporting its leadership and many of its inhabitants, and he conquered the Phoenician cities of Tyre and Sidon, as well as parts of southern Arabia. The invasion of Assyria, as well as the campaign against Judah, and a number of other military and religious events, are recorded on 3 cuneiform tablets that were discovered in the 19th century. These were part of a much larger chronicle, now lost, which recorded in detail a series of events that took place during the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Unlike the inscriptions that were often commissioned by kings to boast about their military victories and their religious devotion, these were more like the biblical books of Kings, whose narrator takes a more impersonal approach towards his subject matter. Though Nebuchadnezzar is vilified in the Bible for his destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, he was known in Babylonia as a builder. Inscriptions from his time tell us that he restored the Isagala temple of Marduk and completed the rebuilding of a ziggurat in his honor, which had been worked on ever since the city was destroyed by Sennacherib. He also decorated the city's Ishtar Gate with colored glazed bricks that depicted lions, which represented Ishtar, bulls, which represented Adad, and dragons, which represented Marduk. Among his other construction projects were a canal that brought water from the Euphrates River and a large defensive wall to the north of the city, which was the usual source of invasions. Though we know about Nebuchadnezzar's military activities from the Bible and from the Babylonian Chronicle, his inscriptions, like those of other Neo-Babylonian kings, tend to promote his image as a builder and a servant of the gods, rather than the military conquests that are more typical of Assyrian reliefs. The last Babylonian king was Nabonidus in the mid-6th century BCE. He was an unpopular ruler who seems to have been more interested in scholarship than administration, which he left to his son Belshazzar. And in 539 BCE, the country was invaded by Cyrus the Great. Cyrus was the member of a dynasty in southwest Persia who had recently defeated the Medes, who were ruling the country, and created his own Persian kingdom. After toppling Belshazzar, he reversed the Israelites' exile and allowed them to return and rebuild Jerusalem. This series of events is described in the biblical books of Daniel, Ezra, and Nehemiah, where Cyrus is portrayed as God's instrument in the restoration of the Jews. The Babylonian exile lasted for about 70 years, but a substantial community of Israelites remained in Mesopotamia even afterward. This community, as well as the one in Jerusalem, were developing the ideas and practices of what is now called Judaism. Because so much of this process, including the early stages of writing the Hebrew Bible, took place in Mesopotamia, the Jewish beliefs about the creation of the world, the origins of humanity, and the nature of the universe were heavily influenced by the Babylonians. For example, the biblical idea that there were 600,000 stars in the sky, and that the world was created by dividing the upper and lower waters, have parallels in Babylonian astronomy and myths. Babylon, under the name of Babel, is also portrayed in the Bible as the first city, where the descendants of Noah gathered after the flood to build a tower of the kind the Mesopotamians called a ziggurat, and like Babylon itself, Babel was built of mud bricks. The point of the story is that God punished the city for its ambitions by giving its inhabitants different languages and cultures, and scattering them across the world to form the nations known to the Israelites, which suggests that they were aware of the diversity of people who lived in Babylon in their time. Babylonia remained a part of the Persian Empire until it was conquered by Alexander the Great in the 4th century BCE. At that point, it was incorporated into the Greek Seleucid Empire, but it remained the cultural and religious center of Mesopotamia, and the Seleucids continued, as the Persians had done, to respect and support the temples of Marduk and the other Babylonian gods, and to portray themselves as the successors of the city's former kings. They were even mentioned in official cuneiform inscriptions, which continued to be produced until the time of the Roman Empire. Historians sometimes use the term afterlife to describe how a person, an idea, or an event is understood in the generations that follow it. But while the Western world, seeing things through the eyes of the Bible and the classical tradition, came to describe Babylon as a symbol of sin on the one hand and of luxury on the other, its reputation among Mesopotamians was very different. While Babylonia did not make the sort of impression that Assyria had with its centuries of military conquest and the large empire that it created and administered, the city of Babylon was, in its own time, a symbol of Mesopotamian religious devotion and cultural pride.
Thanks for watching. Subscribe to my channel for more tutorials. Support me on Patreon so I can keep making content. And as always, feel free to email me, ProfessorDaveExplains@gmail.com.